The closer you look inside Russia's military command, the more you notice a quiet shift taking place. A subtle change in tone, a pattern of warnings, a growing sense of urgency that never appears on state television. Because behind the Kremlin's confident speeches and battlefield promises, a very different conversation is happening in reports, briefings, and off-the-record comments. Not about a dramatic collapse tomorrow, but about the risk of a long-term strategic defeat that becomes harder to ignore with every passing month. This is not an idea invented out of thin air. It's an assessment built from open reporting by outlets such as Reuters, the BBC, The Guardian, independent Russian journalists working from exile, and analyses by military researchers and former Russian officers who argued long before the full-scale invasion that a big war in Ukraine would damage Russia's economy, accelerate demographic decline, isolate the country politically, and stretch its armed forces beyond what their structure was designed to handle. 2 years later, many of the risks they warned about are now clearly visible. This is the story of why parts of Russia's military elite quietly fear where this is heading. Why some observers believe senior officers are mentally preparing for outcomes the Kremlin refuses to acknowledge in public, and why the idea of victory inside Russia's general staff increasingly looks less like triumph and more like damage control. To understand why anxiety is rising inside Russia's high command, you have to look at the forces pushing the war in a direction Moscow cannot easily reverse. The first is the cost of Russia's battlefield strategy. From the earliest months of the invasion, Russian operations have relied heavily on massed assaults and grinding offensives. Newly mobilized troops have often been pushed toward the front with limited training. Battles for places like Bakhmut and Avdiivka became symbols of this approach. Extremely high casualty numbers traded for very modest territorial gains. Western intelligence services, including the UK Ministry of Defense and senior US defense officials, have publicly estimated that Russia's total casualties, killed and wounded, are now in the hundreds of thousands. At the same time, the BBC's Russian language investigative team, working with open source methods, has confirmed tens of thousands of individual deaths by name, and even they describe their own database as only a slice of the total losses. For generals who think in terms of decades rather than weeks, these losses are not just tragic. They are structurally dangerous. They hollow out experienced units. They wipe out mid-level commanders. They destroy the institutional memory that modern armies depend on. Analysts at the Institute for the Study of War and the Center for Strategic and International Studies have described Russia's campaign as a form of territorial grind in which gains are measured in meters, while losses are measured in companies and battalions. Russia can still move the front line, but in the process, it is burning through the very force that is supposed to defend the country in the future. That leads directly to the second pressure weighing on Russia's generals, the state of the economy behind the front. The war is devouring resources at a pace not seen since late Soviet times. According to Russia's own budget data and central bank figures, defense and security spending now take up one of the largest shares of national expenditure in post-Soviet history. Inflation keeps pushing up prices. Labor shortages grow as men are mobilized or leave the country. Several 100,000 Russians are estimated by independent researchers and media to have left after mobilization began in 2022, many of them young and educated. Economists both inside and outside Russia, including those interviewed by the Moscow Times and analysts linked to Carnegie-aligned research centers, warn that Moscow is maintaining the war effort through emergency-style measures, raiding financial reserves, reorienting industry toward arms production, and pushing factories into round-the-clock work. Imports of high-tech components often have to be routed through complex sanction-busting networks. Much of Russia's defense industry still relies on older designs and technology that struggle to match Western precision systems. Generals see all of this in procurement briefings and equipment deliveries. They know the war machine is functioning, but they also know it is not being sustained on terms that look healthy in the long run. In effect, Russia is spending tomorrow's security to pay for today's battles. The third pressure comes from Russia's demographic reality. Long before the invasion, Russia was already dealing with serious demographic decline. Low birth rates, relatively high mortality, and net emigration were shrinking the population. Since the war began, those trends have intensified. Analysts writing for outlets like The Economist, as well as independent demographers who track official statistics, argue that Russia is now experiencing one of its sharpest population contractions since the 1990s. Mobilization has pulled workers out of factories and farms. Emigration has siphoned off skilled professionals and young families. War casualties have removed a cohort of young men who will never return to civilian life. Senior officers do not need classified reports to see the impact. Every new round of mobilization might make the army larger today, but it leaves the country weaker tomorrow. There are fewer workers to run the economy, fewer engineers to design future weapons, and fewer qualified recruits for the next generation of officers. Generals understand that they are drawing from a shrinking pool and that they are doing it faster than the country can replenish itself. The fourth pressure is inside the command system itself. Since the start of the invasion, Russia's leadership has repeatedly rearranged its top military structure. Commanders have been promoted, moved, demoted, and in some cases, quietly sidelined. There have been public disputes, high-profile firings, and visible tension between figures in the defense ministry and alternative power centers such as Wagner before its collapse. Analysts at the Royal United Services Institute and other military research institutes describe the result as an environment where delivering bad news upward carries serious personal risk. In that kind of system, generals quickly learn that saying exactly what they think in public can end careers. That creates a gap between political narrative and military reality. The Kremlin has to project confidence to maintain legitimacy. Generals have to signal loyalty to remain in position, but the maps, casualty reports, and logistical briefings tell a less optimistic story. Officers who understand the true cost of every kilometer taken also understand that political narratives cannot change the limits imposed by manpower, logistics, and technology. The fifth pressure is technological and operational. Ukraine, backed by Western intelligence, satellite imagery, and precision weapons, has turned rapid innovation into a central part of its defense. Ukrainian forces have adapted quickly to drone warfare, building extensive fleets of reconnaissance and strike drones. They use them to target ammunition depots, command posts, oil facilities, and infrastructure deep behind Russian lines. Electronic warfare systems are being updated constantly. Western ISR networks give Kyiv a level of situational awareness that Russia often struggles to match. Analysts at RAND and CSIS highlight that while Russia has also invested in drones and electronic warfare, its adaptation has been more uneven. Russia can produce large numbers of relatively cheap drones, but integrating them into a flexible, information-rich targeting ecosystem comparable to Ukraine's Western-supported network has been difficult. Artillery duels increasingly favor the side that can locate and strike targets faster, which is usually the side with better data. Russia can compensate with sheer volume of fire, but that only reinforces the same attritional pattern that is already wearing down its forces. The industrial side of this gap is equally worrying for long-term planners. Modern tanks and armored vehicles are being lost faster than they can be replaced with new-build models. Open-source imagery and Russian reporting show older Soviet-era tanks, including T-62 and other Cold War designs, being pulled out of long-term storage and sent to the front. Many of these vehicles are older than the officers commanding them. They still have combat value, but they reinforce the impression that Russia is consuming its modern arsenal faster than its industry can regenerate it. The sixth factor shaping generals' concerns is the way nuclear weapons are used in public discourse. Official statements from the Kremlin and state media frequently emphasize Russia's nuclear arsenal and readiness as a deterrent. But several former Russian officers and defense insiders, when interviewed by Western outlets and think tanks, have suggested that many in the professional military view actual nuclear use as extremely unlikely, because it would risk catastrophic retaliation and long-term isolation far beyond anything Russia faces today. In other words, the arsenal is real, but its practical usability in this war is very limited. That disconnect matters. If nuclear weapons are effectively unusable, except in the most extreme scenarios, then they cannot solve the conventional problems Russia is facing on the battlefield and in its broader strategic position. They might deter direct NATO intervention, but they do not reverse demographic decline, economic strain, or battlefield attrition. For generals looking for realistic tools they can actually employ, nuclear rhetoric does not offer a viable escape route. So, what does a senior officer do when territorial gains require unsustainable losses? The economy is strained by war spending, the population is shrinking, the high command is politically sensitive, the technological balance is shifting, and the ultimate deterrent cannot be used without unacceptable risk. The logical response is not necessarily open rebellion, but quiet adjustment. A shift in expectations, a move away from thinking in terms of total victory and toward thinking in terms of damage limitation. According to Western diplomats and analysts who track Russian behavior, some senior figures in and around the security establishment now talk more in private about acceptable end states than about grand triumphs. Ideas such as freezing the front lines, consolidating control over specific territories, or seeking negotiations from a position that can be presented domestically as success are said to appear in these discussions, even while the public narrative insists that Russia will fight until its goals are fully achieved. These signals do not prove a single unified plan, but they do suggest a shift in mindset from expansion to preservation. At the same time, Russia continues to stage and plan large exercises, including future Zapad series drills that official propaganda frames as preparation to confront NATO. Many military analysts interpret these exercises less as confident gestures and more as a way of signaling resilience to domestic and foreign audiences. On paper, they demonstrate that Russia can still mobilize forces and rehearse large-scale war. In practice, they take place against the backdrop of an army heavily taxed by continuous operations in Ukraine. Beyond the battlefield and the budget lies a deeper concern: Russia's overall geopolitical position. The longer the war continues, the more Russia's influence erodes in regions where it once occupied a dominant role. Some Central Asian states are strengthening ties with China, Turkey, or other partners. Armenia has openly expressed dissatisfaction with Russia's security guarantees and moved closer to Western structures. European countries are cutting energy dependence on Russia, rearming and investing in their own defense industries. Sanctions are not perfect, but they still limit growth, investment, and access to advanced technology. At the same time, Russia's economic and political dependence on China is growing. Analysts from multiple think tanks note that Moscow increasingly finds itself in a junior position in that relationship, with fewer options to say no when Beijing sets terms. For Russian strategists who remember when Moscow was one pole of a bipolar world, this shift is not only uncomfortable, it signals a long-term loss of leverage. Generals can see that this war does not just redraw front lines in Ukraine. It changes Russia's place in the world, and some of those changes will be very hard to undo, no matter how the fighting ends. This is why, when officers and analysts inside and outside Russia talk about defeat, they are not always talking about being pushed off a particular piece of land. Many of them are talking about a slower, deeper form of defeat: the erosion of political influence, economic resilience, military capacity, and demographic strength over a long period of time. A defeat that might leave Russia intact on a map, but significantly reduced in power and options. That kind of fear is almost never voiced publicly by serving generals because the stakes are too high. But it can be seen in the way decisions are made, in the caution with which some commanders speak to trusted journalists, in the warnings issued by former insiders who no longer hold rank but still understand how the system thinks. The closer you look, the more this pattern comes into focus. Russia's generals are not openly preparing for the state to collapse. What they appear to be doing, according to many outside analysts, is preparing themselves and their institutions for the consequences of a conflict that will eventually end and may leave Russia weaker and more constrained than before. They know that at some point the army will have to be rebuilt, equipment will have to be replaced, trust inside the ranks will have to be restored, new generations will have to be convinced to serve in an institution shaped by this war. They also know that the international environment they will face after the war will be less forgiving. A more heavily armed Europe, more cautious neighbors, a China that expects more in return for support, a West that has seen the risks of underestimating Russia and is now restructuring its own defenses. Inside the Kremlin, victory still has to be presented as inevitable, both for domestic political reasons and to discourage external pressure. But inside the general staff, victory increasingly looks like finding a way to end the war without permanently crippling the country's ability to defend itself and remain relevant. Russia may continue fighting, it may adjust tactics, it may improve some technologies, it may capture or lose different areas of territory, but none of those fluctuations change the broader trends worrying its military planners: time, economics, population, technology, and geopolitics, all moving in a direction that makes long-term success harder the longer the war goes on. In that sense, when commentators say Russia's generals are preparing for defeat, they are not necessarily imagining generals writing resignation letters or planning coups. They are describing a shift from expecting expansion and dominance to trying to manage decline. A kind of defeat that does not happen in one dramatic moment, but unfolds gradually over years. A defeat that looks less like collapse and more like a slow narrowing of choices and a slow shrinking of power. It is the kind of outcome that no one in the Kremlin can ever openly admit to. Because the moment the leadership acknowledges it, the image of control shatters. And that is the real tension inside Russia's system today. Publicly, the war is framed as necessary and winnable. Privately, many of the people tasked with actually planning for Russia's security are forced to confront a much harsher picture. Quietly, carefully, reluctantly. But increasingly, they have to plan for a future in which the war, even if it delivers some gains on paper, has already pushed Russia onto a path of strategic decline.